Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving into the recent shifts in global geopolitics. They're really quite surprising, actually. Our focus is, well, specifically on the evolving stance of U.S. President Trump regarding the conflict in Ukraine, his relationship with Russian President Putin, and, the future of NATO. It's a dynamic situation. And the core question we're sort of grappling with is this a genuine strategic pivot, a tougher U.S. stance against Russia, or maybe just a transactional adjustment by U.S. President Trump, something that offers maybe short-term political wins but risks long-term instability? We're here to try and give a clear understanding.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating, I think, is how quickly these deeply entrenched narratives can change. Our mission for this deep dive is really to distill the most critical insights from all these developments, help grasp the bigger picture without getting lost in all the noise. We'll be looking at the immediate impact, assessing that, and raising some important questions about what it all truly means for the future.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting. Frankly, quite unexpected. Just recently, new details became evident, confirming a significant shift in U.S. President Trump's view on the Ukrainian conflict. Many expected the absolute worst for Ukraine in the first half of his potential second term. Maybe abandonment to Russian President Putin, but those scenarios, they haven't materialized. It's quite different.
That's exactly right. The key insight here, I believe, is that U.S. President Trump is not abandoning Ukraine to Russian President Putin, nor is he leaving Europe to face Russia alone. In fact, we're seeing a warmer stance towards NATO than in previous years. Diplomatic positions for Ukraine under the U.S. President Trump administration seem stronger than anticipated, especially after that recent reception of Ukrainian President Zelensky in the Oval Office. This development truly enhances Ukraine's chance to maintain independence. It's quite a turnaround.
Okay, so if that's the case, what does this all mean for what many saw as friction? Real friction between U.S. President Trump and Kiev. We understand his previous dislike, the doubts about aid. They were likely tied to Russian President Putin ignoring his earlier peace initiatives U.S. President Trump might have seen as, beneficial to Russian President Putin perhaps, but now it looks like U.S. President Trump has maybe given up that illusion, the idea he could control Russian President Putin just through force of will.
Precisely. And that realization seems to have led to a markedly tougher U.S. position. U.S. President Trump has promised to supply Patriot air defense systems. He even stated they are already being sent. There's also a clear readiness now to tighten sanctions against Russia. So while attempts to compel Russian President Putin to negotiate, they may not work, but U.S. President Trump is at least not just handing over Ukraine.
And beyond that direct support, we also have to unpack this significant 50-day ultimatum U.S. President Trump reportedly delivered to Moscow for a truce. He declared that if an agreement isn't reached in 50 days, these secondary tariffs will be implemented. What exactly are those secondary tariffs? What are the interpretations here?
Right, that's a crucial distinction. The threat, it could be read in two main ways. First, if his plan only involves tariffs on direct U.S.-Russia trade, that's largely symbolic. U.S. imports from Russia in 2024, only about $3 billion. So new tariffs there would cause pretty minimal economic damage to Moscow. Second, and this is the far more impactful scenario, is if the threat means secondary sanctions on countries buying Russian goods, particularly energy. Think China, the EU, India.
Wow. But that's a huge step, isn't it? Going after major partners like India and China with sanctions? That seems like it would provoke significant blowback.
Well, absolutely it would. Such a move would drastically complicate U.S. political and economic relations. It could disrupt ongoing negotiations with key trade partners, stress the U.S. economy. U.S. history shows secondary sanctions are typically used, sparingly, usually against adversaries, not key security partners. And what's more, Russian President Putin and the Russian economy. They've shown surprising resilience to economic pressure. The Russian stock market even went up after U.S. President Trump's latest threats. Russian President Putin sees what he calls the special operation as, a historical necessity, maybe even a matter of political survival for him. So he's unlikely to be swayed by economic intimidation alone, the 50-day ultimatum. It might just give the Kremlin 7 weeks to consolidate gains, maybe at the cost of new strikes on Ukraine. So while it sounds tough, many observers are skeptical. skeptical of its real effectiveness. It's seen more as perhaps a political gambit, creating plausible deniability, shifting the narrative.
Okay, so if the ultimatum is maybe more about playing a political hand than really shifting Russian President Putin, where else are we seeing these surprising strategic moves from U.S. President Trump? Turns out his relationship with NATO is, well, it's undergoing a truly remarkable transformation, this newfound tolerance, even approval for the alliance. It has significantly eased fears that his second term would mean a U.S. withdrawal. So what's the core insight there? What's driving this shift?
Yeah, the key insight seems to be that NATO leadership has successfully found a way to align the alliance's goals with U.S. President Trump's. Let's call it a transactional approach. This positive shift is largely credited to diplomatic efforts. British and French leaders worked extensively with U.S. President Trump, apparently advised Ukrainian President Zelensky on how to engage him, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at that summit in the Netherlands helped secure a big political win for U.S. President Trump. An agreement for NATO members to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. That allowed U.S. President Trump to declare he'd forced Europe to pay, lifting a burden from the U.S. He even said during a joint appearance that a strong Europe is very good. Quite a statement, given past rhetoric.
It certainly looks like NATO is giving U.S. President Trump a political win, but is there a risk here? Could this transactional approach still undermine the alliance's long-term cohesion? Some sources suggest that. It almost sounds like NATO is just solving U.S. President Trump's problems now, a sort of workaround.
You've hit on a crucial point there, about the underlying dynamics. Through NATO, the U.S. is now supplying those Patriot systems to Ukraine, right? But European countries are compensating for the cost. This approach, it creates a symbolic distance for U.S. President Trump in supplying weapons for the conflict against Russia, offers him that plausible deniability if his supporters complain, and, at the same time, it aligns perfectly with his focus on favorable deals, allows him to emphasize new contracts, jobs for the U.S. defense sector. However, and this is important, promises of other offensive weapons deliveries through this scheme, they remain vague. And it seems unlikely that the scale of U.S. assistance will match those huge military aid packages approved by Congress under the previous administration. So yes, it solves immediate political problems for U.S. President Trump, but the long-term impact on the depth of the alliance's commitments, that's still a big question mark.
And this surprising alignment with NATO, it's not just an international thing. It's sparking complex reactions, bipartisan reactions right on Capitol Hill, reactions that could reshape future policy. We're seeing changes in sentiment there. An initiative to tighten sanctions against Russia has garnered significant bipartisan support in the Senate, and U.S. President Trump has shown he can secure a majority in the House for his priorities. So what does this mean for U.S. policy going forward?
Indeed. There's a bill proposed by Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Richard Blumenthal. It's described as a real tool of pressure to isolate Russia. However, this could cause a split among Republicans. For example, Senator Josh Hawley, who opposes more aid to Ukraine, doesn't see an urgent need for a new law, given U.S. President Trump's threats already. And Senator Rand Paul, well, he called the initiative one of the most dangerous bills in Senate history, warned about a potential complete breakdown of trade relations with China, India, Turkey, if they fall under U.S. sanctions. So strong opposition there, too.
So the domestic political reaction to U.S. President Trump's policy shift on Ukraine, it's still highly uncertain, much like the broader geopolitical picture, really. It brings us back to that guiding question. Is this a fundamental, enduring shift or just a temporary tactical adjustment?
And that really is the crucial takeaway here. While U.S. President Trump has indeed toughened his stance toward Russian President Putin, this doesn't necessarily signify a permanent, long-term approach. Not yet, anyway. The future volume of U.S. military support for Ukraine, that remains unclear, even with improved relations between Kyiv and U.S. President Trump. And while NATO countries might be relieved that U.S. President Trump isn't abandoning the alliance, his threats of trade wars have already created a deep transatlantic rift. This suggests that Russian President Putin's core calculation, to simply outlast the West in this conflict, that calculation is unlikely to be fundamentally shaken by these moves. The path to ending the conflict in Ukraine, it's far more complex than just issuing ultimatums. But opportunities for peace, they might still emerge naturally, particularly perhaps as the Russian summer offensive subsides and winter approaches.
So as we dissect these shifting strategies, the core question remains, well, it remains for all of us to consider. Is this calculated step by U.S. President Trump truly towards long-term stability in the region? Or is it merely a temporary reprieve before the next unpredictable turn in global geopolitics? What does this mean for the long game between great powers? And who truly stands to gain or lose in this ever-evolving landscape? Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.